This is the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. There is a war against porn going on right now. A growing number of U.S. states are placing restrictions on people's ability to access it, and some politicians are pushing to ban pornography outright. The view that porn is inherently harmful seems to be growing in the population, and there are a lot of different reasons for this. But one is that porn is often described as being addictive and as a threat to public health. But is that actually true? What happens when you ask people about how porn affects them? Do they see it as being a positive or negative force in their lives? Surprisingly, what we see in the research is that far more people report positive than negative impacts of porn. So yes, some people do struggle with porn use, but it's not really a problem for the vast majority. So let's talk about how porn actually affects us. In this show, we're revisiting an important conversation with Dr. Nicole Prousey that originally aired back in episode 184. We discuss why different studies of porn's effects often yield wildly different conclusions, why porn shouldn't be thought of as addictive in the same way that drugs are, whether there's really a link between porn and sexual violence, as well as how we can have more productive conversations about the controversial topic of pornography. My guest is Dr. Nicole Prousey, a licensed psychologist and sex researcher who founded the sexual biotechnology company Liberos. She is a former Kinsey Institute trainee and has published an extensive body of research on the neuroscience and psychophysiology of sex. She is currently a scientist at the University of California, Los Angeles in the Department of Medicine. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Before we get into the main topic for today, though, here is our Just the Tip segment, presented by Popstar. Popstar was founded by two sexual medicine doctors who are creating science-backed products to support male sexual health and pleasure. Whether you want to last longer, finish stronger, enhance your health, or just make sex more pleasurable, they have a solution for you. In our Just the Tip segments, I'm sharing some of my favorite bedroom tips and tricks. Today, we're diving into the subject of how having a healthy and pleasure-filled sex life can actually make you better at your job. That's right. Let's talk about it. So there's a study that came out last year that I've been wanting to talk about on the show ever since I saw it. It was published in the Journal of Sex Research, and the title of the article was Conceptualizing Sexual Pleasure at Home as a Work-Related Stress Recovery Activity. Basically, what they did in this study was look at how the quality of both one's recent experiences with solo and partnered pleasure were linked to work outcomes, specifically how satisfied people were with their jobs and how engaged they were with their work. What they found was that for people who experienced more sexual pleasure in the last month, whether alone or with a partner, they were actually happier in their jobs and felt more engaged and productive with their work. So why is that? Well, there are at least two potential explanations. The primary one that the authors of the study focused on is that sexual pleasure provides stress relief. People who were experiencing more pleasure in the study reported that engaging in masturbation or partnered sex made them feel physically refreshed, well-rested, and mentally recovered. In other words, they felt less stressed. And it was these lower feelings of stress that accounted for the association between pleasure and work productivity. In other words, pleasure reduces stress, which in turn makes it easier for us to focus on our work. This makes sense because when we experience orgasm, there are a whole host of neurotransmitters and hormones that are released that promote feelings of calm, and they actually make us less reactive to stress. Consistent with this, I was just reading another study the other day, which found that following orgasm, people have lower blood pressure reactivity in response to stress. So physiologically, there's this protective effect of sexual pleasure on our bodies that prevents us from going into overdrive when we experience stress. The other thing that could potentially be going on here is the phenomenon known as post-nut clarity, which refers to the feeling of mental reset that people typically experience when they have an orgasm. For some time afterwards, people usually feel less distracted, better able to focus, and report the ability to make better decisions. I think what's going on with post-nut clarity is that not only are you in this calmer state, but you've also resolved a previous state of sexual arousal. And when people are sexually aroused, there's this mental shift that happens that kind of puts us in a risk-taking state of mind. My friend, Dr. Shana Sparling, has done research on this and has talked about it previously on the show. She's done some research where they've assigned participants to watch one of two videos, one that's sexually arousing or one that isn't. And then she had them play a game of blackjack on a computer. What she found is that the sexually aroused participants actually made riskier moves during the card game than those who weren't aroused. So when we're turned on, we just aren't thinking as clearly. But when we seek relief for that arousal through pleasure and orgasm, we get that mental reset or state of post-nut clarity, which might also be contributing to the ability to be more focused and engaged with our work. So there you have it. Paying attention to our own pleasure at home just might make us better at our jobs. And you don't necessarily need to have a partner because solo pleasure provides a lot of the same stress relieving properties and the same mental reset as partnered sex. So make pleasure a priority. Not only does it feel good, but it also seems to give us some extra capacity and bandwidth to deal with work-related stress. And let's face it, most of us could stand to feel a little less stressed right now. All right, that wraps up our Just the Tip segment presented by Popstar. A huge thank you to our friends over at Popstar for sponsoring the segment and for helping us to have better and more pleasurable sex. We have much more ahead on today's show, so stick around and we're going to jump in right after this short break. Applications are now open for the next Human Sexuality Intensive course at the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. This course takes an interdisciplinary, evidence-based approach to exploring foundational concepts in the study of human sexuality, as well as recent developments and research in the field. This course is relevant to professionals, academics, and individuals in any field where a foundational understanding of human sexuality is beneficial. This course is open to both emerging and established professionals looking to specialize their knowledge, as well as those seeking new career directions. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org and be sure to follow @Kinsey Institute on the socials. Hi, Nikki, and welcome back to the Sex and Psychology Podcast.
Thanks, Justin. What are we going to talk about today?
Well, the last time you were here, we talked all about your research on orgasms. But today, we're going to be talking about your research on porn and how it affects us. But before we get into that, let me first ask the question of what led you to start studying pornography and how it affects us in the first place?
My graduate student. I had no interest. He came up, Cameron Staley, now Dr. Staley, is interested in doing his dissertation testing the porn addiction model, and it ended up being the first published neuroscience study of the concept. So that dragged me in around 2013. We'd always used pornography in research to stimulate a sexual response. We would then study the sexual response was the focus of those studies. But that dragged me straight into these issues of porn effects on humans.
So it wasn't a lifelong dream of yours to be a pornography researcher?
I still don't think I'm a pornography researcher. I care way more about orgasms and physiology, but here I am.
Here you are. Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, before we get into the effects of porn, let me step back and ask the definitional question of how you as a researcher and psychologist define porn. And I ask this because I've seen studies finding that when you ask people what counts as porn to them personally, they have drastically different ideas. For example, some people count the Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue or Victoria's Secret catalog as porn, whereas others do not. And that variability can make it a little tricky to simply ask on a survey, how often do you use porn? Because you don't necessarily know what they're counting. So how do you define porn in general? And how do you define it or ask about it on a survey?
When we're using porn to stimulate a sexual response, we usually just explicitly describe what it was that we showed people. So that's usually very clear and has what we call high internal validity because we know exactly what they saw. We showed it to them. But overwhelmingly, a lot of sex research is survey-based. And so as you described, we are asking people about pornography viewing. And the best studies will provide some description for the participant of what it is you mean by that. And it kind of depends what it is that you're studying. So if you're interested, for example, in the content of what someone is seeing in pornography, you might want the definition to be more expansive. Anything they see that may have nudity or explicit content, you might want to include in a definition if you're studying that. I tend to be more interested in things that provoke a sexual response. So we often in our studies will define it as something intended to provoke sexual arousal. That is, whether you like it or not, or whether you become aroused to it or not. Do you believe the purpose of the media that you're viewing was to cause sexual arousal? That's going to be a lot more narrow. presumably some things might be sexy, but not sexual. So I know these vary a lot. We have a paper out in the annual review of sex research about this topic and all the different definitions people use. But absolutely, it's a problem in getting agreement across studies about the effects of porn because everyone's defining it differently.
Yeah, it is really a key issue. And it's hard, I think, for people to define what porn is. I think that's why in the Supreme Court, when they've dealt with obscenity cases, they've come back to, I know it when I see it, right? So there's something inherently subjective when it comes to defining something like porn. And so when you're doing scientific research, it's very important to be clear on what exactly it is that you're talking about. Now, much has been said and written in the popular media about how porn affects us, but the most popular narrative seems to be that it's inherently damaging and harmful. People even say it's addictive, or that it's a public health crisis, that it's destroying relationships and marriages, that it's rotting people's brains, right? There's a lot that's out there on this, and says that porn is damaging. But if you look at the research, the results are actually very mixed. Some studies point to positive effects, some point to negative effects, some point to positive and negative effects. But that's often not reported. People tend to just cite the studies that support their own view and they ignore or discredit the others. So why is the literature all over the place when it comes to pornography's effects? Is it due to that definitional issue that we were talking about? Is it due to selective publishing by researchers? Or is it simply because porn is a complex phenomenon that has different effects on different people? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So I think, of course, definitions to some extent. My impression in a lot of the research that's happened around porn in the last 10 years is there's been a big shift. So previously, it was really sex researchers who were interested in pornography, and we primarily studied it. But more recently, people found out you can make money off of treating porn as a pathology. And that's got the interest of some addiction researchers. And I happen to have a foot in both worlds. So I was trained in addiction research, worked on alcohol grants for the National Institutes of Health, and now work in an opioid space, looking at opioid prescription patterns in the US and things like that. So there seems to be a big divide. That is, people who came through the addiction filter see everything as addictive or potentially addictive. And they're always looking for that pattern and they see it everywhere they look. And you see that in their publications. That is, the journals that are for those scholars tend to find negative effects all the time. They don't even ask about positive effects. Typically, they assume they could only be negative, and that's the lens through which they analyze their data. And sex researchers then have more likely to have the opposite. That is, see viewing pornography as sexual variability. It's another sex act that could have stigma associated with it, and are more likely to report positive effects or mixed effects. And my sense is this is where the two clash, and partially why I end up in the middle of some of it is, I have publications in both worlds, and the addictions folks are pulling on us to say, oh, you got to admit this and that problem. The sex folks are pulling on the others to say, you got to admit there are benefits, and somewhere in between is probably the truth.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there within the scientific community. And it's something that just kind of seems to be this perennial debate. Like it never goes away. We haven't really found a way to reconcile these things yet. But I think that does make it complex and difficult and challenging for journalists and consumers when they're going to the research to figure out what that truth is, because sometimes these papers are just saying drastically different, sometimes totally opposite things from one another. But that's why it's important for us to talk about it. So let's go back to this idea of porn addiction. People throw this term around all of the time, but it's not an actual diagnosis. It doesn't exist in the DSM or the ICD, which are the primary manuals that describe mental disorders. Now, some of your research refutes this idea that porn is addictive. So tell us a bit about that. Why do you think we shouldn't be thinking of porn as an addiction in the same way that people think about alcohol, drugs, gambling, you name it, as addictions?
Science is mainly focused on model testing, and addiction is a model of behavior. So in this case, the behavior is somebody walks into your clinical practice and says, I have a problem with pornography. Okay, what's the nature of that problem? What is the function? So we've actually had diagnoses relevant for pornography use forever. We have bipolar disorder, where a common symptom of mania is very frequent sexual behaviors that can include pornography viewing and masturbation and other things like that. It doesn't mean that that particular behavior is pathological, but it can be symptomatic of another underlying disorder. And so the question is, when someone says, I have a pornography problem, what's the best way to model that, to understand how that behavior is functioning for them? And there are many pathological and non-pathological models. So examples of non-pathological models would be high sex drive, poor sex education, religious or conservative upbringing. Examples of pathological models would be like an impulsivity disorder, a compulsivity disorder, or addiction. Of all of those models, addiction has the most requirements. It is the most stringent. For example, if you believe that frequent pornography viewing is an addiction, you need to have a shift from initially pleasurable responses to consumption that shift into compulsive patterns where the consumption is just to reduce negative affect. Most people think you also need to have a withdrawal syndrome if something is an addiction. There are lots of other things that go along with that, but those are a couple of examples. And that's where the data just fail repeatedly. And I was never clear on why people started with the highest, most restrictive model in existence. And I don't mind at all if the public uses the term addiction. I don't hold the average Joe to know that is happening and to know that's how science works. But that's why there's this debate. Is sometimes I hear even clinicians who are trained say, well, what does it matter what you call it? I said, what you call it determines how you help. It determines what treatment you would use, if any. So the name couldn't be more important because it reflects the model. And that's why I think a lot of the requirements that most of us agree need to be present to call something an addiction don't exist for sex or pornography.
Yeah, I think you make a lot of really important points there. One being just the difference in how the general public uses the term addiction. It gets thrown around all the time. I'm addicted to this new TV series, or you name it. People like to use that term addiction, but in the clinical sense, the scientific sense of what an addiction means, a lot of these things don't meet that threshold. And something else I wanted to bring up that's related to this discussion of porn as an addiction is, there's also this idea that if something is an addiction in that true clinical sense, that you're going to build up a tolerance to it. And so you're going to need more and more of that particular behavior or stimulus over time to get that same kind of effect. And I know you've done some research looking at whether there's a tolerance effect associated with porn. So what did you find there?
There are a number of threads that address that, but the one I thought was most interesting is we showed sexual stimuli to people who thought they had a problem with viewing pornography and those that didn't. And also people who had more and less sexual partners. So if you think that's an evidence of having a sexual problem, could debate that. But so we showed them sexual stimuli that were more and less explicit. So like this collection of pictures, and some are just like shadowy, kind of romantic. You think they might be naked, but you can't really tell. And the others are, penis and vagina, very clearly kind of more standard modern porn images. And we would expect if people had developed tolerance that their brains would be less reactive to the less explicit sexual stimuli. What we found was the opposite. What that means is people who had more problems or actually had a lot of sexual experience or more partners seemed to be more sexually sensitive. That is, it didn't take much to get their engine started, so to speak. Their brain was like, oh, something sexual. I like that. Let's go see what that's about. Instead of the tolerance expectation, that is, that these weaker stimuli would have caused them to respond less. And it's really interesting. We demonstrated that in a show that ended up on HBO. I won't name the show. And we had two people who thought they were addicted. We tested them. And actually, I was surprised. You don't always see it at the single subject level, but we did. We demonstrated that exact phenomenon, the two people who thought they were addicted, and it was cut from the show. So it's just so people know, when these things go to media, when we try and demonstrate these phenomena, if it doesn't fit the narrative, it doesn't always make it, even though it's scientifically based and well demonstrated. That was annoying. But that's an example of how tolerance doesn't really seem to build up or cause a problem in neural reactivity in this case.
Yeah, and that's a really important point about media because I do interviews all the time, and interviews are often very long. Sometimes I sit down for an hour with a journalist answering questions, and then there's only a couple of tiny quotes that end up making it into the piece. And I think that's something a lot of people don't realize about what they're reading is that, there was a whole lot of context that went into this, and that often gets dropped. And so I think that's also part of the problem with a lot of the media narratives about porn is that they just sort of pick and choose certain things that fit the story that they want to tell. And it doesn't always give that nuance that you need when you're talking about porn because it is this complex phenomenon. Hey guys, confidence in the bedroom isn't just about mindset. It's about how your body performs too. And if you've ever felt like your orgasms could be, more, you're not alone. And that's where Popstar comes in. Popstar's Volume Plus Taste Enhancer is a doctor-formulated supplement designed to naturally boost semen volume, support reproductive health, and enhance overall sexual performance. Let's be real, for many guys, bigger is better. Greater semen volume can actually mean better sensation, a more powerful climax, and a big boost in confidence. And Popstar makes it easy. With a science-backed blend of ingredients like zinc, bromelain, and L-arginine, Popstar works with your body to naturally increase semen volume and even improve taste. All you need is just 4 capsules a day. Most guys see results within 3 weeks, and the longer you take it, the bigger the benefits. So if you're ready for more volume, stronger climaxes, and next-level confidence, check out Popstar Volume Plus Taste. Save 20% off your first order by using my name, Justin, as the discount code. Check the show notes for the link or visit popstarlabs.com/Justin. So even if porn doesn't technically meet that threshold for being an addiction in the clinical sense, there are some people who report that porn is causing negative effects on their lives. And that raises the question of why is that? Is it because the porn itself is harmful? Or is porn the symptom rather than the cause of the problem? Someone who uses porn might feel ashamed of their porn use, and then that creates mental distress. And so maybe it's sexual shame that's the root of the issue. So can you tell us a little bit more about this? When someone sees porn as being harmful to them personally, what are some of the reasons for that?
The number one reason when people make that report seems to typically be depression in reality. So many people, even who are in inpatient treatment ostensibly for porn addiction, actually have an underlying major depressive issue. And what that means is they're feeling down, but they may use pornography to help elevate their mood. And then they may be, in my mind, misdirected to characterize the porn as the problem. And I say, no, this is classic depression. We should treat the depression, for which we have many excellent treatments. And there's some research to suggest with depression, especially, the overwhelming majority of people have sexual interest decrease when they become depressed. But there's a subset for whom it increases. And we think that maybe what this is reflecting is that maybe 15%, looking at those studies and in non-clinical samples, suggest that depressed mood may increase sexual interest for those folks. And that's not a small group. So if I hear someone say that, my first suspicion is they may have a depression problem. And that's what I would investigate first clinically. If they have a problem that really seems circumscribed around pornography in particular, so we've ruled out bipolar disorder, we've ruled out medication effects from Parkinsonian medication, like all these other things that it's more likely to be clinically, then there are at least a couple of approaches. There is an acceptance and commitment therapy that helps folks who believe they have a pornography problem think about their own life values and how porn fits into that, what exactly is causing the conflict for them. And it doesn't seek to eliminate porn viewing, although it often reduces it. The goal of that therapy is really just to reduce distress around pornography viewing, but it doesn't conceptualize it as a disorder or pathology. The other common approach is to use couples therapy. So I've taught and done couples therapy for many, many years. And often this becomes a problem because one partner views and the other has values that conflict with it. So they think either you're cheating on me or you're doing that because you don't want to be with me, or all of these things that can happen. And the partner often feels very guilty. Maybe they've promised they won't do it again, and they go and cheat by looking at porn. And now you've lied. That's created a new problem. So it's very common that we address that in a couple's context where we say, okay, what are your expectations? Because it's usually about masturbation, where the couple is trying to negotiate a difference in desires. Most commonly in heterosexual relationships, the guy will have higher drive. She doesn't want to have sex as often. And so he's masturbating to kind of make up the difference, say, I don't want to cheat on her. I'm going to do this. This is, I won't pester her for sex if I'm satisfying that drive in some other way. And she says, how could you? Do you want them instead of me? And we address that in a couple's context to understand what the meaning and function of masturbation is in their relationship. So it's a little all over the place, but we're always, when we hear that report, we kind of have to go through this clinically, like, okay, how are we going to, what's the best way to understand how the porn viewing is functioning for this person or this couple?
Yeah. And I really appreciate that and the approach that you take there, which is to say, all right, somebody is complaining about a problem regarding porn. What else is going on in their life that is surrounding that? I think all too often we have a tendency to just want to blame porn and say porn is the issue. And there are some therapists, clinicians, counselors, coaches, others who will just target the porn and say, well, you have a problem around porn. Let's deal with that. Let's eliminate the porn viewing. But when you do that, you're not treating the underlying issues that might be present that aren't going to go away just because you reduce porn watching. And that's where you can start to have some problems that are created because you're treating the symptom rather than the cause. So such an important point to keep in mind in all of this.
That's what I meant, what you said.
Now, in recent years, we've seen a growing number of U.S. states formally declare porn to be a public health crisis. And we're starting to see some legal restrictions put in place when it comes to porn access, such as the new law in Louisiana that requires third-party age verification before you can access an adult site. So like you literally have to upload your driver's license and, have it verified so that you can watch porn, which is a little scary, I think, to a lot of people because of the potential surveillance implications there. But at any rate, many of these laws and declarations are rooted in the idea that porn causes sexual violence. Now, I know this hasn't necessarily been a focus of your research, but what can you tell us about the research that has explored the link between porn and sexual violence?
The study that's most classically cited is a study from the early 80s that looked at an interaction of people who had a internal tendency, like a personality tendency towards violence, in this case, a belief in rape myths. So, for example, this questionnaire would say, when I buy a woman dinner, she owes me. She needs to give me something in return. That's not true, but some people believe that more or less. And those kind of myths, when they're endorsed, if that person's also viewing violent pornography, they seem to be more likely to also be engaged in sexual violence. That study was so widely cited, someone finally attempted to replicate it a couple of years ago in a very rigorous pre-registered study, and were unable to replicate it. So despite that, it's continually repeated. We see it in the news all the time. And so the main kind of evidence that had been cited, I think, doesn't hold up. It may have even been true at the time and isn't any longer because of how ubiquitous viewing became since VHS and then internet. It's hard to know. But I do think there's a relationship between, for example, folks who choose to view content that some people are counting as violent or considering violent, and things that other researchers may not. So many times when people talk about violent effects or associations between pornography, violence, and these effects, they include things like spanking, whipping, things that are common parts of BDSM, bondage, domination, sadism, masochism practices that are wanted by both parties. So they're viewing these as violence despite their kind of role in that. And that was part of UK legislation. There was a widely cited study that included spanking as violence. And I think a lot of researchers dispute that characterization and say that that's not an accurate way of thinking about it. So there's a lot of debate as to what is violence in pornography. If it's non-consensual, how do you know that that wasn't consensual? And trying to then go from that to make causal statements, I think, is currently not possible. That is, the data you would need that are longitudinal or more experimental really don't exist. And experimental would be tough in general.
Yep.
But even the association studies just aren't consistently there. And especially the kind of debunking of that older study, I think was a really important step in investigating that. I don't think we've ruled it out by any means. There are many studies reporting associations. We need to understand what that's about and if that could be evidence of cause in the future. But there's not currently data that really establish a cause between starting to view that content and that leading to some type of a sex offense.
Thank you for that very detailed, very nuanced answer. It all goes back to that definitional issue that we were talking about at the beginning of, how do you define porn? And then further, how do you define something like aggressive porn? And then how do you define sexual violence? Different people apply different definitions. Sometimes in definitions of sexual violence, as you said, they're counting consensual kink in that. And so, that's where that literature can also start to get a little bit messy. So we need to be very clear when we're studying these topics on how exactly we're defining all of these concepts. And, I've seen a lot of work looking at this link between sexual violence and pornography consumption. There are some studies, they're correlational, that suggest that as pornography has become more widespread, more ubiquitous, the rates of sexual violence have actually gone down, which is surprising to a lot of people because the narrative you hear in the media is that sexual violence seems to be happening more and more, but the rates are actually going down in this time when there's more porn than ever before. I think my preferred way of thinking about it is I like the confluence model for thinking about, what is the link between pornography and sexual violence, where you have to look at characteristics of the individual, their personality traits, their beliefs and how they feel about women and so forth. And then you also need to look at what type of porn they're consuming and how much and, the situation. And so it's kind of like this biopsychosocial model. And I think that's just my preferred way of thinking about everything when it comes to sexual behavior, is that it's complicated and it's not as simple as X causes Y.
I'd throw in as well, I like in this sense to look at different content from choking and incest. So a lot of people talk about the problematic content around those two things. I don't think incest is necessarily violence, but we'll just use it as a different example of content. And there are all these reported rises in choking that are being attributed to pornography, and yet we don't see any data on a rise in incest. And so if you think that porn is driving these and causing them, then you have to say, well, why one and not the other? The apparent rise, and it's hard to document what's actually gone up or what are people actually viewing, because those are private companies that we can't access. But I've always been very curious about that. If you think this is driving that and causing it for the first time, then where are all the incest events that we should be seeing as well?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Now, in studies where people are asked about how porn affects them, substantially more people report positive effects than negative impacts. So let's talk about the potential positive side of porn for a second. So what are some of the ways in which people might see porn as a positive influence in their sex life?
There are some studies showing younger folks who, not children, but in the 16 and above age range is typically where we can start to ask in some countries. Those youth who view more pornography tend to have more accurate genital knowledge, which makes sense. They're very clearly viewing it. Those folks who are members of LGBT minority communities, sometimes when they view pornography, are less likely to experience or feel stigmatized about their minority sexual orientation status. In other words, if they may have a community that's not necessarily supportive, but they can see there are, in fact, adults who do and like the behaviors they're interested in, that might be comforting or a help to them. There's a large literature showing that women who view more pornography tend to have higher relationship satisfaction, higher sexual satisfaction, higher orgasm consistency, a lot of associated positive effects. And that's always been a little difficult to understand because we get typically the opposite reported for men. And so what I wanted to mention in this context is this is really about masturbation. Pornography is primarily used for masturbation. And men and women in heterosexual relationships generally seem to use porn in very different ways. That is, men tend to use it in a more compensatory fashion, and masturbation in a compensatory fashion. Women tend to use it in a more excitatory fashion. And what I mean by that is there's literature showing, for example, during pregnancy, when women's sexual interest tends to wane in the third trimester, men tend to compensate by increasing their masturbation frequency. So they kind of, I would say, steady as she goes. It's like they keep the same orgasm output, however they need to achieve that or experience that. women, if they have a loss of interest, tend not to compensate and are more likely to say they're using pornography or masturbating to excite themselves for sex with a partner. Not always relational, but it's more likely to be for that purpose. And so if the woman is on average the lower partner, then those who view more, you can imagine, are more likely to meet male's desired sex frequency, and therefore the relationship is happier, etc. So we have this huge gender difference apparently between the effects of pornography, where women seem to get a lot of positive effects and it seems to associate with negative effects in guys, but it really seems to be due to the different way the genders are using masturbation.
So interesting, and just further gets at how complex and nuanced this literature is in terms of all of the effects of pornography. Now, one other question about this, and this is a really hard one. I don't expect you to necessarily have the answer for it, but we've been talking about pornography as something that is complicated and it can have positive effects. It can have negative effects. It's not a simple story. So how can we have more productive public discourse on the subject of porn? Because it seems like everyone's just talking past everybody else for the most part. So I don't know if you have any thoughts to share on that.
Science. And I do think often what happens, so we have a study I think we'll talk about a little down the road that we just recently had come out. And it was the funniest thing. There were people that were talking about it, but only because they'd viewed a news article about it and saying, this is obviously an agent of the porn industry and we're Illuminati and we're pornographers secretly. And I'm like, okay, like they didn't even get the study, they didn't see what we wrote. So I do think it's, the media works on clicks. The more hateful, the more engaging typically. And so it's difficult to imagine kind of getting the temperature down in the public discourse. And what I like is, even though we disagree vehemently in science, is there is a procedure for that. You can write a letter. Typically people get to write one response. It's all public and documented, and it forces you to slow down and think, because man, is peer review slow. And so I really like that as a way to kind of look at what's possible, and not that overcomes selective citations, or reading selectively. But it does seem to be a venue where the discussion is forced to be slower, and there's some amount of peer review and back and forth that occurs within a confined context, where there aren't immediately threats. My sense with the public discourse is it's gotten to the point that there are very quickly very violent threats, and there's no discussion that can take place in that context, unfortunately. So I don't have a high confidence in the ability of media to do a reasonable job when there are violent threats around the discussion.
Yeah. And as long as a lot of media outlets are making their money off of trying to rile people up and have these kind of inflammatory posts, and also catering to very short attention spans and catering to people who already have certain pre-existing beliefs as a way of cultivating a loyal following, then we're going to keep having these problems when it comes to just talking past one another. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Nikki. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
I have a website on librocenter.com. And if you're academically inclined, ResearchGate accounts where you can request and I will send you all of my scientific articles.
Well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate having you here. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller, and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.